Shadows on the Mountain. Chapter 1. The journey begins. The Callahan family was looking for a change. Dan and Maria Callahan, along with their two children, 13-year-old Jake and 10-year-old Emily, decided a family trip would be the perfect way to break free from their routine. Dan, a history enthusiast, had read about an old, abandoned village nestled in the mountains. The village, called Black Hollow, was known for its picturesque views and rich history. It seemed like the perfect place to explore and camp for a few days. As they packed their SUV, the excitement was palpable. The drive to Black Hollow took them through winding roads and dense forests. The higher they climbed, the denser the fog became. Emily looked out of the window, her nose pressed against the glass. "Dad, are we there yet?" she asked for what felt like the 100th time. "Almost, sweetheart," Dan replied, glancing at the GPS just a little further. The road narrowed as they reached the base of the mountain. The trees, tall and ancient, seemed to close in on them. Maria felt a chill run down her spine, but she brushed it off as the cool mountain air. "It's beautiful up here," she said, trying to convince herself more than anyone else. Chapter 2. The Village of Black Hollow. As they approached Black Hollow, the fog lifted slightly, revealing a village that looked as if it had been forgotten by time. The houses, though old and dilapidated, still stood strong. The cobblestone streets were covered in moss, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. "Wow, this place is amazing!" Jake exclaimed, jumping out of the car as soon as they parked. "Can we explore?" "Of course," Dan said, stretching his legs. "But stay close. We don't want to get lost." They walked through the village, marveling at the old architecture. Emily found a small, weathered doll half buried in the ground. She picked it up, brushing off the dirt. "Look, Mommy, a doll." Maria smiled, but the doll's eyes seemed to glisten in the dim light, giving her an uneasy feeling. "Maybe we should leave it here, Emily. It belongs to the village." Emily pouted but placed the doll back on the ground. They continued exploring until they found a clearing suitable for setting up their tents. As they worked, the sky darkened, and an eerie silence settled over the village. Chapter 3. The First Night. After dinner, they sat around the campfire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. The fire's crackling was the only sound breaking the silence of the night. Emily yawned and snuggled into her sleeping bag. "Good night, everyone," she said sleepily. "Good night, Emily," Maria replied, stroking her daughter's hair. "Sleep tight." As the night grew colder, they all retreated into their tents. Dan and Maria shared a tent while Jake and Emily had their own. The wind howled outside, and the trees cast long, twisted shadows. Dan woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It sounded like whispering, but he couldn't make out any words. He sat up, listening intently. The whispering grew louder, and he could hear footsteps outside their tent. He shook Maria gently. "Maria, wake up. Do you hear that?" Maria groggily opened her eyes. "Hear what?" "The whispers and footsteps." "Listen." But as they both held their breath, the sounds stopped. "It must be the wind," Maria said, trying to reassure herself. "Go back to sleep." Dan lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. He kept his eyes on the tent flap, waiting for any sign of movement. Chapter 4. Strange Discoveries. The next morning, Dan decided to explore more of the village. He hoped to find some clues about its history. Jake and Emily went off to play near the edge of the village, promising to stay within sight. As Dan walked through the narrow streets, he found an old church. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open. Inside, it was dark and cold. Dust particles danced in the rays of light streaming through the stained glass windows. He noticed a large, ornate book on the altar. Curiosity piqued, he opened it and found pages filled with strange symbols and diagrams. Back at the campsite, Maria was tidying up when she heard Emily scream. She dropped what she was doing and ran towards the sound, her heart pounding. She found Emily standing near the forest edge, her face pale. "Emily, what's wrong?" Maria asked, kneeling beside her daughter. I saw someone, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. A lady in white. She was standing right there, watching me. Maria looked around, but saw no one. It's okay, sweetheart. Maybe it was just your imagination. No, Mommy, she was real. Emily insisted, tears streaming down her face. Maria hugged her tightly. Let's go back to the campsite. It's probably just the shadows playing tricks on you. Chapter 5: The Secrets of Black Hollow. Dan returned to the campsite, excited about his discovery. I found an old book in the church. It looks like some kind of diary or journal. Maybe it can tell us more about this place. They gathered around the fire as Dan began to read aloud. The journal belonged to a priest who had lived in Black Hollow centuries ago. He wrote about strange occurrences in the village, mysterious disappearances, and sightings of a ghostly woman in white. Maria's face grew pale as Dan read on. That sounds like what Emily saw, she said, her voice shaking. The priest believed the village was cursed, Dan continued. He wrote about rituals and sacrifices meant to appease the spirits that haunted the place. The wind howled louder, and the fire flickered. Shadows danced around them, and a sense of dread filled the air. Chapter 6: The Descent into Darkness. That night, the Callahans huddled together in their tent, too scared to sleep. Around midnight, the whispering began again, louder and more insistent. Dan and Maria held each other, listening as the whispers turned into wails of anguish. Suddenly, their tent was ripped open by an unseen force. Cold, bony hands reached in, grabbing at them. Dan fought back, but it was like trying to push through smoke. Maria screamed as she was dragged out into the darkness. Jake and Emily woke up to the commotion and ran out of their tent. They saw their parents struggling against invisible assailants. Mom! Dad! Jake shouted, trying to reach them. Run! Dan yelled, his voice filled with terror. Take your sister and run. Jake grabbed Emily's hand, and they sprinted towards the forest, tears streaming down their faces. They ran until they could no longer hear their parents' screams. Chapter 7: The Forest of Shadows. Jake and Emily stumbled through the dark forest, branches scratching at their skin. They could hear whispers all around them, but there was no one in sight. They found a small cave and huddled inside, trying to catch their breath. Jake, what are we going to do? Emily asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, Jake admitted. But we can't go back. We have to keep moving. They spent the rest of the night in the cave, too scared to sleep. When dawn broke, they cautiously made their way out. The forest was eerily silent, and a thick fog hung in the air. As they walked, they came across an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Maybe we can find something useful in there, Jake said. They entered the cabin, the floorboards creaking under their weight. Inside, it was dark and musty. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and dust covered everything. They found an old lantern and some matches. Jake lit the lantern, casting a dim light around the room. Look, Emily said, pointing to a trapdoor in the floor. What's down there? Jake hesitated but then opened the trapdoor. A narrow staircase led down into the darkness. Stay close, he told Emily as they descended. Chapter 8: The Hidden Chamber. The staircase led to a small, underground chamber. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars and bottles of strange, preserved objects. In the center of the room was a large, wooden table with an old, leather-bound book lying open. Jake picked up the book and flipped through its pages. It was filled with detailed drawings and descriptions of rituals and spells. This must be what the priest wrote about, he said. Emily shivered as she looked around the room. I don't like this place, Jake. Let's go. But before they could leave, the air grew cold, and a figure appeared before them. It was the ghostly woman in white that Emily had seen. Her eyes were hollow, and her mouth was twisted in a silent scream. Leave this place, she whispered, her voice echoing in the small chamber. Or suffer the same fate as those before you. Jake and Emily backed away, terrified. They ran up the stairs and out of the cabin, not stopping until they were far away. Chapter 9, The Final Stand, continued. They made their way back to the village, avoiding the shadows and whispers. In the church, they set up a circle of candles around the altar and placed the book in the center. Jake flipped to a page with a ritual that promised to banish evil spirits. Emily stood beside him, clutching the doll she had found earlier. She had taken it with her, feeling a strange connection to it. "What do we do now?" she asked. Jake read the instructions carefully. "We need to read these words aloud and light the candles one by one. It says the spirits will try to stop us, but we can't let them." They began the ritual, chanting the ancient words. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the church started to move. The whispers turned into angry hisses, and the candles flickered. As they lit each candle, the spirits became more aggressive. Invisible hands tried to snuff out the flames, and the ground trembled beneath them. The ghostly woman in white appeared, her eyes filled with rage. "You cannot stop us," she hissed. "You will suffer as we have suffered." Jake's voice wavered, but he kept chanting. Emily joined in, her voice small but steady. Together, they lit the final candle. A blinding light filled the church, and the spirits screamed in agony. Chapter 10, The Light of Dawn. When the light faded, the church was silent. The oppressive darkness was gone, and the air felt lighter. Jake and Emily stood in the center of the circle, trembling but unharmed. "Did we do it?" Emily asked, looking around. "I think so," Jake replied, relief washing over him. They left the church and headed back to their campsite. As they approached, they saw their parents standing there, dazed but alive. "Mom! Dad!" Jake shouted, running towards them. Maria and Dan embraced their children, tears streaming down their faces. "We thought we lost you," Maria said, her voice choked with emotion. "We thought we lost you too," Jake replied. "But we did it. We broke the curse." Chapter 11, The Return Home. The Callahan family quickly packed up their belongings and left Black Hollow. As they drove down the mountain, the fog lifted, and the sun broke through the clouds. It felt like the world was welcoming them back to safety. They didn't speak much on the drive home, each lost in their own thoughts. The horrors of Black Hollow were still fresh in their minds, but they were grateful to have made it out alive. Once home, they vowed never to speak of their ordeal again. They returned to their routine, but the experience had changed them. They were closer, more appreciative of each other, and more aware of the fragile line between the seen and unseen. Epilogue, The Unseen Watcher. Years passed, and the memory of Black Hollow faded. But late at night, when the wind howled and the shadows danced, Emily would sometimes see a glimmer of movement out of the corner of her eye. She knew the spirits were still out there, watching and waiting. And in a small, forgotten village in the mountains, the ghostly woman in white stood silently, her eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the day when the cycle would begin again.
Don't forget to subscribe.